Throughout history, there have been many people who were executed in the most brutal and harrowing ways. But some kings, queens, high-status politicians, and world leaders were taken to their deaths upon structures such as the scaffold or gallows within execution chambers or in front of their own people. For example, Saddam Hussein, the deposed dictator of Iraq, was condemned within a prison, and his execution was even captured on video. The French king, Louis XVI, and his queen Marie Antoinette were deemed to have been ignorant tyrants, and they would meet their ends on the guillotine in front of thousands. The dictator of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife Elena were also ruthlessly shot in front of television cameras after revolution broke out across their nation. But throughout history and the centuries, there were many more world leaders, presidents or monarchs who met a horrific and brutal end, being condemned to death. In this documentary we take a trip throughout history to look at the brutal executions of world leaders. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Gaddafi was born in a tent in the Libyan desert, and no one would have predicted how he rose to prominence. At university he was a talented student, and then he began to plot to overthrow the Libyan monarchy. He graduated from the Libyan Military Academy in 1965, then rose through different promotions, and he had a goal in mind to overthrow the government and to stage a military coup. On the 1st of September 1969 he seized control of the government in the military coup that deposed the king Idris I. He became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and chairman of the new governing body in the country, the Revolutionary Command Council. He removed the US and other countries from military bases in the country the following year, and expelled large amounts of people from Libya, and then he nationalised all foreign-owned petroleum assets in the land. In accordance with his religious beliefs, he also banned alcohol and gambling, and was opposed to negotiations with Israel. He became a tough negotiator, and his government were involved in a number of coup attempts in Sudan and Egypt, and they were meddling in the long civil war in Chad. Gaddafi became known for being unpredictable and erratic, and his government financed a number of groups with revolutionary ideas, including even the IRA in Northern Ireland. Libyan spies would assassinate opponents and dissidents abroad, and his government were involved in a number of terrorist incidents inside of Europe. He came into conflict with the American government, and in April 1986, a force of British-based American warplanes bombed sites in Libya, and even killed and wounded some of Gaddafi's children. But they missed a key target. As mentioned, he was involved in the Lockerbie bombing over Scotland, which destroyed a civilian aircraft, killing 270 people on board. He faced sanctions for this and further isolation, but then later, as the 21st century came around, Libya announced it would drop its unconventional weapons programme, and many of the sanctions were then lifted. Gaddafi was trying to rehabilitate his image, and he was then elected the chairman of the African Union in February 2009. But in February 2011, anti-government demonstrations forced presidents from power in neighbouring Tunisia and Egypt. Then anti-Gaddafi demonstrations broke out in Benghazi. Protests then spread throughout Libya, and Gaddafi's regime tried to brutally put them down. He ordered direct fire of live ammunition at protesters, and they were attacked by fighter jets and helicopter gunships, and this was condemned all around the world. The violent tactics showed that he had not changed, and a number of ministers defected and then supported the uprising. On the 22nd of February he appeared on television and gave a defiant speech refusing to step down, and he called the protesters traitors. But his leadership seemed weak, and by the end of February the protesters had taken large parts of land, including they managed to encircle Tripoli. Gaddafi remained in control but was living in isolation, and he insisted he was still well loved, and he believed that Al-Qaeda were behind the opposition. Further pressure called for him to step down, then the UN stepped in, imposing a travel ban and arms embargo on him, and they freezed his family's assets. In some areas his forces did regain lands, but then the UN Security Council voted on the 17th of March to take military action in the country to protect civilians. Because of this, NATO launched an air campaign and significantly damaged Gaddafi's forces, but this eventually led to a stalemate. Further high-profile defections occurred, and Gaddafi continued to refuse to step down. On the 30th of April, a NATO airstrike killed his youngest son and 3 of his grandchildren, but Gaddafi was in the house at the time of the attack. Whilst this was also happening, war crimes charges were being drawn up against his regime, and there were arrest warrants issued for him along with his son and the intelligence chief. A lot of these charges and accusations revolved around the orders to fire on civilian protesters. But then in August 2011, Tripoli would fall as rebel fighters took control of large areas, and they then captured his headquarters and ransacked the compound. Gaddafi's whereabouts were unknown, and rumours were that he was with heavily armed loyalists in Sirte. He refused to leave and flee or give over power, but then the last loyalist district of Sirte fell and he decided to flee. At 8:30 on the 20th of October 2011, the loyalists tried to escape in a convoy of 75 vehicles, and the fast-moving convoy with Gaddafi in it was spotted, and NATO intercepted a call made by the leader. Then NATO fired on 21 of the vehicles, destroying one, and an American Predator drone fired, and then French fighter jets continued the bombing. They killed dozens of loyalists, and after the first strike the convoy split up, and rebel units on the ground also attacked. NATO claimed they did not know Gaddafi was in the convoy, and that they were not involved in the capture. Following the airstrike which destroyed the vehicle in front of Gaddafi's car, he and his son took shelter in a nearby house, which was then shelled. Muttasim, his son, then with 20 fighters went on the lookout for undamaged cars, and it was said the group belly-crawled to a sand berm, looking for a way to escape. One of the guards threw a grenade, and then it hit a concrete wall and fell in front of Gaddafi, and a guard then picked it up and it exploded, killing 2 people. But it was time to hide for the former leader, and he hid out in a large drainage pipe with a number of his bodyguards. A nearby group opened fire, and they wounded Gaddafi in the leg and back, and there were rumours that one of his own bodyguards shot him to avoid being captured and being tortured, being taken alive. However, he was then ordered out of the drain, and he got out slowly, and he was then dragged up to his feet. A UN report claimed there was a different story of events, as he'd been wounded by fragments of the grenade, and this shredded his flak jacket. Apparently he was on the floor dazed and in shock, and bleeding from the head, and then one of his groups surrendered. But after his capture he was killed. Different reports of this exist. One said that he said, "Please don't shoot," before he was shot by rebel fighters. He was questioned before and denied any involvement, and one fighter ordered him to stand up, and he could not do so. In one video he said, "God forbids this, and do you know right from wrong?" when his captors shouted at him. He was also seen lying on the front of a car, and it said no official execution order was given to execute Gaddafi. It was also said they captured him alive, and whilst he was taken away, they beat him and killed him. Another account said, when the car was moving, it was caught in crossfire between the revolutionaries and Gaddafi's forces, in which he was hit by a bullet in the head. What is certain, though, is that he was set upon by Misrata fighters, who wounded him with a bayonet in the backside, and then began to pummel him with kicks and fists. It's believed that he was also shot. But by the time he was placed in an ambulance, his body was lifeless, and it's believed he had been killed at this moment. Many people posed for photographs with his remains, and he was stripped and also verbally abused. The doctor's official examination said he had been shot in the head and also the abdomen. But then his body was placed on public display to allow the people of Libya to see their former dictator dead. His body was placed in an emptied public freezer in Misrata, and thousands travelled to see it. One said that he had a number of gunshot wounds which had residue on them, showing he had been shot dead at close range. His body was also displayed alongside his son's, and then the remains were passed over to his family, and they were buried in a secret location. Gaddafi's death was one of the most shocking of the 21st century, and much of his final ordeal was captured on mobile phones, and the world's media then showed his downfall. He was a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most shocking and violent dictators of the 20th century, and in the aftermath of his death, a number of his supporters wounded and tortured one of the men who captured him. They tortured this man for days, and this showed the anger that many had towards his killing, especially those who remained loyal to him. Gaddafi was a man who was a violent and oppressive dictator, whose stronghold over Libya lasted for decades. Between July and December 2003, Task Force 121 conducted 12 raids to find Saddam Hussein, which were unsuccessful, and 600 other operations were carried out against other targets. These were then interrogated, and on the 1st of December 2003, a former driver of Saddam's mentioned Mohammed Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit as Saddam's right-hand man. He was known as a Fat Man, and over the next 2 weeks, 40 members of his family were interrogated to find out where he was. But then on the 12th of December, a raid on a house in Baghdad captured Omar. He then revealed the location where Saddam could be found, and further intelligence was gathered that pinpointed Saddam Hussein's location to a remote farm location south of Tikrit. The operation to snatch Saddam, Operation Red Dawn, was launched, and 2 site names, Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2, were to be investigated. There were around 600 soldiers involved in the mission, including even cavalry and artillery. The forces at first cleared the 2 objectives, but Saddam could not be found. But as the soldiers were finishing up their investigation, one of them kicked a piece of flooring to the side. In doing this, he exposed a spider hole and a tiny hole in the ground, and he was ready to throw a grenade inside of it, in case it led to a tunnel system containing hostile forces. But as he was about to do this, Saddam Hussein appeared, and then the soldier struck him with the butt of his M4 carbine and disarmed Saddam of his Glock pistol. He offered no resistance and surrendered, and was then taken to the mission support site before he was transferred to Baghdad and was held in custody at the airport. Along with his pistol, he had an AK-47 with him and roughly $750,000. After this, Saddam was then placed on trial. His first hearing took place on the 1st of July 2004, and in this he stated, "This is all theatre, the real criminal is Bush." He defended Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait, referring to the people as dogs, who were trying to reduce the women of Iraq into nothing. His language was crude and he did not hold back, but Saddam was then charged with a number of different charges the following year. He was accused of killing 148 Shiites from Dujal, following a failed assassination attempt. He questioned the legitimacy of the court and said, "Neither do I recognise the body that has designated and authorised you, nor the aggression, because all that has been built on false basis is false." Saddam claimed he was the president of Iraq, and there were many incidents throughout his trial where he showed defiance against the authority of the courtroom. He told them to go to hell at one point, and then even refused to enter the courtroom and complained about his imprisonment, and said that his American captors tortured him, saying, "I've been beaten on every place of my body, and the signs are all over my body." But on the 5th of November 2006, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death by hanging for the killing of 148 Shiites. When the verdict was announced, Saddam screamed, "Long live the people, long live the Arab nation, down with the spies, God is great." It was believed that the appeals would go on for years, but on the 26th of December 2006, Saddam's appeal was rejected and the death sentence was instated. No further appeals were allowed, and it was said that Saddam must be executed within 30 days of that date. The decision had to be signed off by the Iraqi president, but could not be commuted. Saddam requested to be executed by firing squad instead of hanging, and he claimed that it was lawful as a military execution, and he wanted to be shot as a soldier and as the commander-in-chief of the Iraqi military. This was denied, and 2 days before his execution a letter was published, in which he asked the Iraqi people to unite and to not hate the people of the countries that invaded Iraq, but instead hate those at the top of these nations who ordered the invasions and made the decisions. He claimed he was ready to die as a martyr. In the final hours before his execution, he had a final meal of chicken and rice, and also had a cup of hot water with honey. The execution was scheduled to take place at 6 a.m. local time, and it took place at the joint Iraqi-American military base of Camp Justice in Qazimain in Baghdad. Saddam was to be executed alone, away from the eyes of his co-defendants. It was said that the Americans wanted to delay the execution by 15 days, because they weren't keen on having him executed right away. The day before the execution, the Prime Minister's office provided all the documents they asked for, and the Americans changed their mind when they saw the Prime Minister being very insistent. It was a case of finalising details. It was said that the US had no direct involvement in Saddam's execution after he was handed over to the Iraqi government. There were reports that before his execution, Saddam was submissive and that he carried the Quran. A witness disagreed with this though, as it was said Saddam kept shouting, "Down with the invaders," as he entered the chamber, and when he was asked if he had any fear or remorse, it was said he replied with, "No, I'm a militant. I have no fear for myself. I've spent my life in jihad fighting aggression. Anyone who takes this route should be not afraid." He remained defiant, even as a noose and rope was placed around his neck. After the rope was secured, he shouted, "Do you consider this bravery?" As he was stood there, a version of an Islamic prayer was recited, and one witness said to Saddam, "Go to hell." He then replied with, "The hell that is Iraq." Another masked guard said, "You have destroyed us, you have killed us, you made us live in destitution." And Saddam replied with, "I have saved you from destitution and misery, and destroyed your enemies, the Persians and Americans." But then the deputy prosecutor tried to bring proceedings to a calm, saying, "Please stop, this man is facing an execution." He then began to recite the Shahada twice, and near to the end of the second time, the trapdoor sprang open, and instantly Saddam Hussein was left hanging, and he was killed. There was a loud crack as he plunged through the trapdoor, and with this his neck was broken. After he was left hanging for some minutes, the doctor then approached his body and listened to a heartbeat, and then declared that Saddam Hussein was dead, and was confirmed dead at 6:03 a.m. There were rumours after his death that Saddam's corpse was stabbed a number of times, but this was disputed, and other witnesses claimed this did not happen. His body was then buried in his birthplace near to his family members, and the bodies of his two sons, Uday and Quase, at 4 a.m. on the 31st of December 2006. The tomb in which his body was buried was later destroyed, and it was said his body was removed by a Sunni tribal group before the tomb was destroyed. There was some criticism regarding Saddam Hussein's death sentence, as some believed it was unjust and others considered that he was a martyr. There was also criticism about the trial he had, and that this had been unfair. But ultimately Saddam Hussein was a man who led a repressive regime in Iraq, and was responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. The circumstances of the invasion of Iraq are still debated today, as it's considered that hundreds of innocent servicemen and women lost their lives in an invasion that had little justification. The issues with Iraq were not solved with Saddam's execution, and they continued for a number of years. Charles I was having a number of issues with Parliament during his reign. They were fierce enemies, and the king believed he had been given a divine right to rule by God, and that no one could challenge him. But Parliament were concerned about a number of policies the king had, and the fact he was spending large amounts of money and making terrible decisions. With this, Parliament quickly seized London, and Charles fled the capital for Hampton Court Palace. But within a few months in mid-1642, Parliament and the king had begun to arm, and they both raised armies to fight against each other. Negotiations broke down and Charles raised the royal standard in Nottingham, going to war with Parliament. After a number of battles, it was clear that things were going poorly for the king, and Parliament managed to seize Charles I. He was held under house arrest and did manage to escape Hampton Court at one point, but he was then quickly arrested again and was held on the Isle of Wight. Charles had no chance of winning the war, and Oliver Cromwell refused any further talks with the king. They regarded as a bloody tyrant, and with this they were acting quickly to secure their own power. Charles I was moved to a number of castles, and was sent to Windsor Castle, where he was indicted for treason, and he was then brought to trial. He was accused of using his own power for his own gain, rather than what was good for his country. It was said that he, for accomplishment of such his designs, and for protecting of himself and his adherents in his and their wicked practices, to the same ends, hath traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament, and the people therein represented, and that wicked design, wars, and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been, and are carried on for the advancement of upholding of the personal interest of will, power, and pretended prerogative to himself and his family against the public interest, common right, liberty, justice, and peace of the people of this nation. It was estimated that around 300,000 people and 6% of the population died during the Civil War, and Parliament thought he was guilty of all treasons, murders, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs to the nation, acted and committed in the said wars, or occasioned thereby. Charles refused to plead and claimed the trial was illegal, and he said, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, The authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against a king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power have totally changed the ancient government. He was then removed from the court, and then over the next few days was sentenced to death, and 59 commissioners signed Charles I's death warrant, including Cromwell. Charles I did not have long before his death sentence was carried out, and the execution occurred on the 30th of January 1649. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, and Charles spent his final days praying. He also burned his personal papers and correspondence, and he was allowed to see his two youngest children, Elizabeth and Henry, for one last time. He told Elizabeth to remain Protestant and stay true, and that Henry should not become king if he is approached to do so by Parliament. He split his jewels between his children, and then had a restless last night. He woke up early on the day of his execution, and began to get dressed at 5 a.m. in all black in his blue garter sash. He spent a while getting dressed, and gave further instruction as to what should happen with his final artefacts and possessions. He was given an extra shirt so the crowd would not see him shiver on the cold morning, and at 10 a.m. he was summoned to go to Whitehall for his execution. He drank a glass of wine and ate some bread at noon, but outside the banqueting house a huge crowd had gathered outside the platform where Charles's execution would take place. The scaffold was covered in black material, and the execution block was very low, much lower than a normal block. This was so low that the king would have practically had to lie on the floor for his head to be taken off. At 2 p.m. the king was called to the scaffold, and he emerged through the window of the banqueting house and climbed onto the scaffold. One onlooker stated that it was the saddest sight England ever saw. He looked at the crowd and saw a huge barrier of guards, which would prevent him from being heard if he made a speech, so he spoke to one of his attendants on the scaffold, who recorded his final words. Charles said, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom, as much as whosoever, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having of government by those laws, by which their lives and their goods may be most their own. It is not for them to have a share in government, that is nothing, sirs, appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clearly different things, and therefore until that be done, I mean until the people be put into that liberty which I speak of, certainly they will never enjoy themselves." He also said he would go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown in heaven. He said one final word to an attendant who gave him a silk nightcap to put on so his hair did not trouble the axeman. Charles said, "Remember," before he then laid his neck onto the low block, and then he readied himself. Quickly the executioner then struck, and in one clean blow from the axe, the executioner took his head clean off. The executioner then held up the head of the king to silence, and he did not declare the king as a traitor, and following the execution it's believed there was an audible groan, and that the people who witnessed it were not happy with what happened. The king's head was then dropped into the crowd, and a number of soldiers rushed to it and dipped their handkerchiefs in Charles's blood, and they then cut off his hair. The body was then put into a coffin, and this was covered with black velvet. There are a number of people who are suspected of being the person who executed the king. The most probable candidate for the job was Richard Brandon, who was a common hangman at the time. Charles's execution was done by clearly a man who was very skilled and who had cleanly cut off a number of heads, as he did do a successful job. He also executed other key royalists, but Brandon did refuse that he did this initially, but allegedly confessed to being the executioner of the king on his deathbed. The identity of the executioner and his assistant was kept private, and this was done to protect them, as they believed there would be a significant amount of backlash, and many of the usual axemen inside of the capital refused to do the job of killing the king. Many people in England believed they had killed a martyr and a man who was sent by God to rule over the country. In Europe, many people reacted negatively to the event, and many claimed that Cromwell was nothing but a regicide and a usurper who had committed a heinous act in organising the king's execution. The event today is still seen as rather controversial, and many consider Charles I to have been a victim of Cromwell and the effects of the English Civil War, but others consider him to have been an evil monarch who did nothing but act in his own interests. But the execution of King Charles I has to be one of the most shocking and significant events in English history. Born on the 2nd of November 1755 in Vienna, Austria, Maria Antonia was the youngest daughter of the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, Empress Maria Theresa, and her husband Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was clear that she was destined to live a lavish lifestyle, and she spent her early years living in the royal Austrian palaces. She was well educated, however teachers commented on her lack of aptitude for learning, and she was rather poor at writing in different languages, and was also poor at speaking different languages. For princesses, mastering different languages was extremely important, as the hope was that they would marry a prince or king from a different country to forge alliances, and this did not stand Maria in good stead. She was a talented musician preferring more practical things than the academic, and it was said that her heart and character were excellent. In February 1770, Louis XV of France requested the hand of Maria for a match with his oldest surviving grandson, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. This was accepted to seal an alliance between the nations, and the Dauphin and Maria became engaged and then married by proxy. She met her husband on the 14th of May 1770 at Versailles, and there was a mixed reaction to the marriage. Marie initially was liked by the French people, but some did oppose the alliance with Austria. Following the death of Louis XV, the Dauphin became King Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette became the Queen of France. She initially had little influence over her husband, but received extremely lavish gifts from the king. Allegedly, one chateau she was gifted was renovated with the walls covered in diamonds and gold, and she continued to spend extremely heavily on luxuries. At the time, France was suffering greatly from financial problems, and the people of France were in great hardship, with many being even unable to buy bread for their family. Because of this, many poor people were dying, but in the face of this, Marie the Queen kept spending huge sums of money on her dresses, hairstyles, luxuries and furniture. There were riots in France, and she began to become a figure of hatred, even being blamed for the economic crisis. Everyone could see what she was doing, but Marie ignored it. Her husband Louis was also suffering. A number of blunders had lent him poorly to the French population. The couple did have children, but problems in France still remained. There was a celebration, especially with the birth of the Dauphin, but Marie also became involved in European politics. At court she promoted her favourites, and it's alleged had affairs with high-up members of society, but leaflets about the Queen's sexual deviance emerged across France. Allegations of the Queen having affairs and illicit behaviour was levelled against her, including accusations of affairs with women. With this, her mother feared for her daughter's safety, but things continued, spending large amounts of money, buying property and living the high life. More allegations emerged too regarding her lifestyle, with some levelling accusations of illegitimacy against her second-born son. With Marie willing to become involved in politics, she wanted to improve her image. The diamond necklace affair occurred, which was a scandal at court, in which part of France's most valuable jewellery was virtually stolen. Tricks emerged and it was levelled that Marie Antoinette's name was linked to the swindling of the jewellery, and this further enhanced Marie's negative reputation, despite her lack of involvement. Louis XVI often asked Marie for advice on politics, but there was a situation brewing between the Assembly and the King. But the major factor in the revolution was the financial problems in France. This was due to a number of expensive wars Louis took part in, a royal family who spent heavily, an unwillingness from the higher-up members of society to help out the lower classes. Marie became a target of disgrace, and when the revolution broke out, it had devastating consequences for the king and queen. The revolution in France had a number of key events that saw the monarchy overthrown. The storming of the Bastille was a sign of the king's decreasing power, and how the people could rise up and overthrow the monarchy, and the anger they had towards Louis and Marie, and the desperation spurred on the revolt. The revolution even forced the royal family to move out of their palace, and European powers sought to try and find a way for the French royal family to escape the anarchy. Several plots were drawn up, but the Queen rejected them, as she refused to leave without Louis, her husband. The royal family found themselves imprisoned, and on the 21st of September 1792, the National Assembly declared France a republic. Previously, an angry mob had broken into the French royal palace and insulted Marie and threatened to kill her, and there was bloodshed inside of the palace. With the declaration of the Republic, Louis was placed on trial and was sentenced to death on the 15th of January 1793. He was then 6 days later executed by guillotine in front of a huge crowd in Paris. The Queen, now a widow, was in great mourning. She hoped that one day her son would become king, however was a prisoner to the French people. Whilst imprisoned at the Tower of the Temple, she along with her children were insulted and kept under strict watch to ensure she could not communicate with the outside. Marie's fate after Louis's execution became a big question, with debate occurring as what to do with her. Others wished to have her executed, but some wanted her exchanging in a swap for French prisoners of war, or even sending to America. Decisions were made to retrain her son, the 8-year-old Dauphin, in the ways of the revolution, and Marie was transferred from the temple to a small cell in the conciergerie. She was kept under constant watch and was given no privacy during this time. She was brought to trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and it's thought that the outcome had already been decided that she would be put to death. She faced a number of different charges, financial ones regarding her relationships, and even planning massacres. She was even accused of incest, but little could be done, and she was found guilty of 3 main charges: of the depletion of the national treasury, of conspiracy against the security of the state, and of high treason, and for this she was sentenced to death. She believed the worst she would get would be imprisonment, so the death sentence came at a shock. In her final days she wrote to her sister-in-law, expressing her love for her children and her devotion to Catholicism, and her will was made. In preparation for her execution, she was forced to change her clothes in front of the guards. She was forced to wear a plain white dress, although wished to wear a black one. Her hair was cut short against her wishes to ensure that the guillotine took her life without any issue. As she was taken out of her cell, she was bound with her hands tied behind her back, painfully hurting the former Queen of France. Marie was then placed on a rope lead and taken to her carriage. She was taken to her execution on an open cart, with it taking an hour to arrive at the Place de la Révolution. The crowds would have lined the streets as the slow cart moved throughout the city of Paris, and when she arrived at her execution site, the guillotine stood ready for her. At around 12:15 p.m. on the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette stepped onto the scaffold to greet Charles Henry Sanson, a notorious executioner who took her husband's head 10 months before. He was stood in a black mask and probably never dreamed of the fact he would execute the Queen of France. As she approached the executioner, she stood accidentally on Sanson's foot and said, "Pardon me, sir, I didn't mean to." Whilst on the scaffold it was said she maintained her composure, but the crowd hurled insults and jeers at her. A priest accompanied her, and everything was ready for the Queen's execution. Minutes after she made her way onto the scaffold, she was placed onto the guillotine. Marie Antoinette's execution was remarkably swift, as was common with the guillotine, and her head was taken clean off by the blade. She would have been placed onto the board, then slid under the blade before it fell, and within seconds her head was taken clean off. Her head was then held up to the crowd, and Sanson proclaimed to the roaring crowd, "Vive la République." Marie Antoinette's remains were then taken to a graveyard behind the Church de Medellin, around a half a mile away. The gravediggers were on a lunch break, which allowed Madame Tussaud to take a wax imprint of her face before she was then placed in an unmarked grave. Decades later her body was exhumed and she was given a proper burial, and it was said that some of her white hair remained on her skeleton. Marie Antoinette was a very divisive figure in France, and the vast majority of the French population greatly disliked her for her lavish spending, all whilst the French were struggling to buy loaves of bread. She was a figure of the monarchy in France and became a controversial figure of the French Revolution. Some see her as a scapegoat, but what cannot be excused is the expense she spent on nonsense during her time as queen, gambling away thousands whilst everyone was suffering. Without Marie, there most probably would not have been a revolution in France. Patrice Lumumba was born on the 2nd of July 1925, and he would become the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He was born in a small village named Onula in Kauai province in the Belgian Congo. As a young man, he was involved in the different groups that influenced his political ideas, and he would emerge as a prominent politician in the lands. He did have two big rivals who came from larger ethnic groups, but Lumumba was from a smaller one, and his group were not considered the most powerful at the time. Following his schooling, Lumumba then went to work, and he became involved in a club of Western-educated Africans, and he would then, at the time, write many political essays and poems for Congolese publications. He did apply for Belgian citizenship, and he received this, and he then became a postal sorter before he would train to become an accountant inside of the post office. But throughout his life he continued to write for Congolese newspapers. Lumumba then, in 1955, became a regional president of a trade union of government workers, and he then also became involved in the Belgian Liberal Party, and he travelled to Belgium to visit the country that held large parts of land in the Congo. But when he got back, he was arrested, was imprisoned for a year for embezzling the post office where he worked. But following his release, he got more involved in politics. Along with other powerful politicians, Patrice Lumumba would launch the Congolese National Movement, the first national political party, and he would meet other important African leaders across the continent. His party had a voice of militant nationalism, and the Belgian government would, in December 1959, announce that they would help Congo head towards independence. But many believed this was a scam, and that the Belgians would put who they wanted in charge, and there were clashes with the authorities, and in one incident 30 people died. Lumumba was then accused of being involved in the riot, but the Congolese National Movement then won a large victory in Stanleyville. The party, though, would not cooperate with authorities until Lumumba was released, and he was then taken to Brussels, where a national election was proposed. His party would emerge as the largest and biggest party, and he was then asked to form the first government on the 24th of June 1960. He then accepted the position of Prime Minister, and at the time many soldiers rebelled against the Belgians, and the Congo would ask the UN to step in to expel the Belgians from the lands. The UN refused to help suppress the revolt, and Lumumba then asked the Soviets for aircraft to transport soldiers to Katanga, where a revolt was occurring. But his actions were developing alarm across the world, but then President Ceausescu would sack Lumumba, and there was a military coup as Colonel Joseph Mobutu seized control with Ceausescu. The UN would recognise this new government, and at the time Lumumba had been placed under house arrest, and he was guarded by UN soldiers and Mobutu's men, and following the General Assembly's decision, Lumumba would escape from house arrest, and he was then re-arrested and was taken to a military camp. But he was at the time considered very dangerous, and he was then transferred to a military barracks to be held. He was kept alongside two of his close political allies who had planned to help him set up a new government. The prisoners were poorly fed, and Lumumba wrote, "In a word, we are living amid absolutely impossible conditions. They're against the law." But discipline at the camp where he was held went downhill, and soldiers were not paid, and they refused to work until they were, and many supported the release of Lumumba, and others thought he was very dangerous. But the conclusion was reached that holding him as a prisoner was considered too much of a risk. Because of this, the question as to what to do with him emerged, and Lumumba was then taken to the state of Katanga. Whilst on a flight he was restrained, and was then on his arrival yet again placed in house arrest, where he was brutally beaten and was tortured by officers. The president and cabinet decided what to do with him, and then his execution was ordered. Shortly after arriving, he was taken to a quiet location, where there were 3 firing squads had been gathered, and these were led by a Belgian officer named Julien Gat. It's believed at the time that many countries did have plans to assassinate Lumumba, and the head of the CIA would state that he wished Lumumba would fall into a river full of crocodiles. The execution was carried out by the authorities of Katanga on the request of the president, who was there to witness the proceedings. One by one, the men, including Patrice Lumumba, were lined up against a tree. Then the executioners were told to ready. It was around 9:40 p.m. in the evening, and within 3 minutes the 3 men were dead. Lumumba was forced against a tree, and then the firing squad shot quickly straight into him, and his body was then thrown into a shallow grave. The next morning the local government took the decision to then desecrate his remains. They wanted to prevent his remains falling into enemy hands. So they dug Lumumba's body up, and then dismembered the corpse, and they dissolved the remains in sulfuric acid, and the bones were then ground up and were scattered. The only part of him that remains today was a single gold tooth. It would be 3 weeks until the Congolese authorities confirmed the death of Lumumba. There were reports that his body was kicked after he was shot also, and that his death would be formally announced on the 13th of February 1961. He was 35 when he was shot, and following the military coup, he was imprisoned under harsh conditions. He was a man who would turn to the Soviet Union for help before this, and this brought the Americans, who were at the time locked in the Cold War, to suspect Lumumba, and the CIA had plotted at the time to assassinate him. They had drawn up plans for this, and Eisenhower, the president, had been told that Lumumba should be eliminated. The plans to assassinate him were discussed months before he died, and money was even allocated to accomplish this. But there were other governments, including the British government, who wanted to get rid of him, as it was believed he posed a serious threat to the British interests in the region and the mines in Katanga. The head of MI5 would state, "I can see only 2 possible solutions to the problem. The first is a simple one of ensuring Lumumba's removal from the scene by killing him. This should solve the problem." All of the accounts have led to speculation that other countries were involved in his death. There was a repatriation of the final and last remains of Lumumba, and this is mostly just a gold tooth, as there was nothing left of him. The children of Lumumba received the remains of their father in Brussels, and the Belgian Prime Minister would say, "For my part, I would like to apologise here in the presence of his family for the war in which the Belgian government influenced the decision to end the life of the country's first Prime Minister. A man was murdered for his political convictions and his words and ideas." But the execution of Patrice Lumumba was a brutal and swift one, in which he met his end at a firing squad, and following this, there was little left of him. Nicolae Ceausescu was a member of the Romanian communist youth movement in his early life. In 1936 he was imprisoned, and then 4 years later he was arrested again for his Communist Party activities. He married Elena, a communist activist, in 1939, and whilst in prison he became the protégé of his cellmate, who became later the communist leader. He managed to escape from prison in August 1944, before the Soviet occupation, as the Second World War was raging on, and he then served as a secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. When the communists rose to power in Romania in 1947, he first headed up the Ministry of Agriculture, and he then served as a Deputy Minister of the Armed Forces, as a Major General. He then became the second most powerful person in the party's hierarchy. But following the death of the leader, Ceausescu rose to the position of the leader of the Romanian Communist Party. He then became the head of state, and he won popular support for his independent nationalistic beliefs, and he openly challenged the dominance and power of the Soviet Union over Romania. He brought to an end Romania's involvement in the Warsaw Pact alliance, and he also condemned the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But then in 1974 he became the president. His police limited free speech, and they tolerated no internal dissent or opposition, and the regime was oppressive, and they outlawed contraception and abortion. With this, maternal mortality rates rose heavily, as women sought unsafe methods to end their pregnancies. Those who did dissent would be sent to prisons where they were tortured and treated awfully, but Ceausescu's government was heavily in debt to foreign governments. They had a number of poorly managed industrial ventures, and with this in 1982, Nicolae decided to export most of Romania's agriculture and industrial production to ease the debts. But this caused extreme poverty and shortage of food, fuel, medicines and basic necessities, to the point where the standard of living in the country heavily fell. Along with this, he appointed many members of his family, including his wife, into positions of power in the government. Elena Ceausescu in government worked as a secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she wasn't important until her husband became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. She accompanied her husband on visits abroad, including state visits to China, and she continued to get roles in senior positions inside the Communist Party. She rose to become the second most important and influential person after her husband, and she was deeply involved in the politics alongside her husband. A cult of personality emerged around the Ceausescus, with Elena being regarded as the mother of the nation, and it's believed that her desire for advancement and honours, and also vanity, was larger than her husband's ambitions. She controlled the way she appeared on camera, and was never supposed to be shown in profile as she did have a large nose, but in March 1980 she became a first deputy prime minister. But tensions in the 1980s were rising in Romania, and protests would break out. On the 16th of December 1989, the Hungarian minority in Timisoara held a protest in response to attempts by the government to evict a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes. The government claimed he was inciting hatred and wanted to remove him from his post and get rid of him. The crowd became angry and impatient and began to chant anti-communist slogans, and then the police arrived at the scene. But that evening the protests had grown and spread, and the original cause was forgotten. Some protesters attempted to burn down buildings, and the police and security forces responded with firing tear gas and using their water cannons, and the police beat up many of the rioters and arrested them. The group then began a protest march around the city, but they were confronted yet again by security forces. The next day the protests and riots resumed, and they broke into district committee buildings and threw propaganda brochures out the window, and even threw Ceausescu's writings out. The military was sent in to bring the situation to an end, but the situation was getting worse and growing larger. The army failed to establish order, and chaos erupted with gunfire being shot and fights breaking out. There were many who were injured, and cars were being set on fire, but then the tanks were sent in. There was wild shooting from Liberty Square around the city, and helicopters were overhead. Some areas looked like a war zone with blood on the streets, but Ceausescu then left to visit Iran, leaving the crushing of the revolt to his wife and his subordinates. Whilst he was away, martial law was declared and a curfew was ordered, but many defied this, including a group of 30 men who waved the Romanian flag which had removed the communist coat of arms. These were fired upon and some died, and many others were seriously injured. Elena then sent in other officials to deal with the riots, and they agreed to free the majority of arrested protesters, but when Ceausescu returned on the 20th of December, he gave a televised speech expressing his anger for the revolution. On the 21st of December he then addressed around 100,000 people to condemn the uprising. Busloads of workers arrived and were given flags and pictures of Ceausescu under duress to drown out the protesters. However, Nicolae was out of touch, and many of the crowd began to jeer and boo and whistle insults at him, and then the crowd roared for the uprising that had begun. He became desperate, but then movement came from the outskirts of the crowd, as did the sound of gunshots, fireworks or bombs, and chaos broke out. The crowd tried to disperse, and there was news that security forces were firing on the crowd as the revolution was unfolding. The speech was broadcast around the nation, and Ceausescu and his wife panicked and were hustled back into the building. The crowd turned into a riot, chanting "Down with the dictator" and "Death to the criminal," and as time went on many more people took to the streets. Anti-terrorist special squads were brought in, and soon the crowd was being shot at by the army from a number of buildings. There were many casualties as victims were shot, clubbed to death and stabbed by government forces. Some were even run over, as one APC drove over the crowd, crushing people. Water cannons were turned on, and then police continued to batter and beat everyone they saw, and intense firing and shooting continued into the night. In the early hours of the 22nd of December, the Ceausescus made the decision to wait until the early morning to flee the city. Before 7 a.m, Elena heard that there were large amounts of workers heading for the city of Bucharest to join in with the protests. Martial law was brought back in, and there was a ban on large groups. However, hundreds of thousands were gathering in central Bucharest. At 9:30, Vasile Milei, the Minister of Defence, died under suspicious circumstances, and many believed he hesitated to follow the orders given to him by Ceausescu to fire on the demonstrators. The new Minister of Defence, Victor Stanculescu, would later refuse to fire on them, which played a pivotal role in the overthrow of the government. He would later claim, "I had the prospect of two execution squads, Ceausescu's and the revolutionary one." However, Nicolae and Elena then headed for the roof of the building they were inside of, and they were to be airlifted off a roof. but a group of protesters made their way into the building and overpowered the bodyguards before heading to the balcony. They were meters from Ceausescu, and the lift's electricity failed before it got to the top. The personal pilot of the president was given instructions to airlift them out of there, but it became impossible to land where he wanted. He later said, then Stilica, the co-pilot, came to me and said that there were demonstrators coming to the terrace. Then the Ceausescus came out, both practically carried by their bodyguards. They looked as if they were fainting. They were white with terror. Maniu Manescu and Emil Bobu were running behind them. Manescu and Bobu and another Securite officer scrambled to the 4 seats at the back as I pulled Ceausescu in. I saw the demonstrators running across the terrace. There wasn't enough space. Elena, Ceausescu and I squeezed in between chairs and the doors. We were only supposed to carry 4 passengers, and we had 6. They left for Snagov, and when they arrived, Matalan's unit commander said, "There has been a revolution. You are on your own. Good luck." Matulan told the Ceausescus he could do no more. The security detail then tried to flag down a car, and they were picked up by a doctor who did not really want to help. He then faked car problems, and they were picked up by another driver, but they were then arrested by local police and were transported to a garrison military compound and held captive until they were placed on trial. The trial of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu was rather brief, and it lasted around an hour. They would defend themselves and were accused of genocide with over 60,000 victims, subversion of state power by organising armed action against the people, offensive destruction of public property by destroying and damaging buildings, undermining the national economy, and trying to flee Romania, using over $1 billion deposited in foreign banks. It was in a sense a show trial, as they were convicted of all charges and were condemned to death. They did not have the chance to choose their own lawyers, and Nicolae would question the authenticity of the court. But regardless of this, the Ceausescus were to be executed for their crimes, and this was seen as a violent and bloody end to the Romanian dictatorship. Just days after the revolution had broken out, they were dead. Elena and Nicolae were executed at 4 p.m. on a military base outside of Bucharest on Christmas Day 1989. The execution was performed by a firing squad which was made up of paratroop soldiers. Hundreds, it's believed, volunteered to take the lives of the dictator and his wife, and Nicolae Ceausescu would state, before that, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade." The Ceausescu's hands were tied by 4 soldiers before the execution. Before the sentence was carried out, Elena screamed, "You sons of dogs," while she was led outside and lined up against a wall, and this wall was against the side of the barrack building. Whilst this was happening, Nicolae sung the Internationale, and as the pair were stood against the wall, the firing squad then began firing quickly. The execution was hastily arranged, and the executioners were trigger-happy, to the point where the television crew, which was there to capture the death sentence, was not ready. In fact, they only managed to capture the last rounds of shots fired from the guns. A retired captain would later tell newspapers that he believed the shots from his rifle were the ones responsible for the deaths of the Ceausescus, because of the 3 soldiers assigned to fire, he was the only one who remembered to switch his Kalashnikov rifle to fire fully automatic. Because of this, at least one of the members of the group hesitated as he fired, and in 1990 it was found that around 120 bullets were lodged inside the bodies of Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu. The execution was deemed to have been carried out quickly, as they were worried that loyalists would try to rescue them. But following the execution, their bodies were covered in canvas, and they were flown to Bucharest and then interred inside a cemetery. The Ceausescus were the final people to be executed in Romania before the abolition of capital punishment on the 7th of January 1990, and their death brought a bloody end to their decades of power over Romania. Mary Queen of Scots had been placed on trial inside of the very place where she would lose her head, and she was accused of treason, but she said that she had never been a subject of the English Queen, and as an anointed queen herself, she said there was no way she could be convicted of treason. But her involvement in the Babington plot condemned her to death, and this plot would have placed Mary on the throne of England if it had been successful. But this would have also seen the death of Elizabeth I, as the plotters planned to kill her. But this was foiled, and the plan was to then sentence Mary Queen of Scots to death. Following the trial, Elizabeth had a big problem, as she would differ on signing the death warrant of Mary, who was her first cousin. She was worrying about executing another woman who was a queen, and she would for the rest of her life consider this, and she believed in her own final days that Mary's execution would prevent her getting into heaven. But Mary would be held inside of Fotheringhay, and on the 7th of February 1587 she was told the next day she would be executed. Messengers arrived to pass on this, and that evening she spent her final moments in prayer, and made arrangements to distribute her possessions to the women of her household, and she also crafted her final letters and also her will. But whilst this was occurring, inside of Fotheringhay Castle's Great Hall, there was a huge transformation taking place, as a room where banquets would be held would become an execution chamber. The platform and scaffold which was in the centre of the room was where the execution would take place, and the block was found on the platform which Mary would rest her head on, and then the axe would come down upon her. The scaffold was decorated in black cloth to mark the moment, and there were 3 steps to climb onto the scaffold, and also a cushion for Mary to kneel on. There were 3 stools for her and other witnesses, including the Earl of Shrewsbury and Kent, who would sit on them. The executioner was a man named Bull, who was considered skilled, and he had been fetched along with his assistant to get to Fotheringhay quickly to perform the job of taking Mary's head off her shoulders. The next morning the time came for Mary Queen of Scots to meet her executioner, and she spent many years locked up, and she felt liberated by her execution. She believed that her time had now come to transition into heaven, and that before she was just existing and not living. She entered the Great Hall with quiet, calm and dignity, and this surprised the witnesses, and 2 of the female attendants remained with her. One detailed account of her execution tells what happened, and it stated that, "Here Mary Queen of Scots' prayers being ended, the executioners kneeling desired her grace to forgive them her death, who answered, I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Then they, with her 2 women helping her up, began to disrobe her of her apparel. Then she lay her crucifix upon the stool. One of her executioners took from her neck the Agnus Dei, which she, laying hands off it, gave to one of her women, and told the executioner he should be answered money for it. Then she suffered them with her 2 women to disrobe her of her chain of pomander beads, and all other her apparel, most willingly, and with joy rather than sorrow, helped to make herself unready, putting on a pair of sleeves with her own hands, which they had pulled off, and that with some haste, as if she had longed to be gone. All this time they were pulling off her apparel, she never changed her countenance, but with a smiling cheer she uttered these words, that she never had such grooms to make her unready, and that she never put off her clothes before such a company. Then she, being stripped of all her apparel, saving her petticoat and kirtle, her 2 women beholding her great lamentation and crying and crossing themselves prayed in Latin. Then she, with a smiling countenance, turning to her manservants, as Melvin and the rest standing upon a bench nigh the scaffold, who sometime weeping, sometime crying out loud, and continually crossing themselves prayed in Latin, crossing them with her hand, bade them farewell, and wishing them to pray for her, even until the last hour. This done, one of the women, having a Corpus Christi cloth, lapped up 3 corner ways, kissing it, put it over the Queen of Scots' face, and pinned it fast to the caul of her head. Then the 2 women departed from her, and she, kneeling down upon the cushion most resolutely, without any token of fear or death, she spake aloud the psalm in Latin, In te Domine confido, non confidar in aeternum. Then groping for the block, she laid down her head, putting her chin over the block with both her hands, which, holding there still, had been cut off had they not have been espied. Then lying upon the block most quietly and stretching out her arms, cried, In manus tuus Domine, 3 or 4 times. Then she, lying very still upon the block, one of the executioners holding her slightly with one of his hands, she endured 2 strokes of the other executioner with an axe, and she making very small noise or none at all, and not stirring any part from her place where she lay, and so the executioner cut off her head, saving one little gristle, which being cut asunder, he lifted up her head to the view of all the assembly, and bade God save the Queen. Then her dress of lawn falling from off her head, it appeared as grey as one of the 70 years old, polled very short, her face in a moment being so much altered from the form she had when she was alive, as few could remember her from her dead face. Her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Then Mr. Dean, Dr. Fletcher, the Dean of Peterborough, said with a loud voice, So perish all of the Queen's enemies. And afterwards the Earl of Kent came to the dead body, and standing over it, with a loud voice said, Such end of all the Queen, and the Gospel's enemies. Then one of the executioners, pulling off her garters, espied her little dog, which was crept under her clothes, which could not be gotten by force, but by force, yet afterwards would not depart from the dead corpse, but came and lay between her head and her shoulders, which being imbued with the blood of her was carried away and washed, as all things else that had been covered in her blood were either burned or washed, and the executioners sent away with money for their thieves, not having anything that belonged unto her. And so every man being commanded out of the hall, except the sheriff and his men, she was carried by them up into the great chamber, lying ready for the surgeons to embalm her. As mentioned, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots did not go well. An execution during the Tudor period was considered successful if it was performed in one swift blow of the axe. The axe was considered less reliable than the sword, but the haste of the execution of Mary would result in a swordsman not being able to be fetched from places in Europe. Many also would probably not have wanted to take the job of executing a Catholic queen. But the first blow of the axe missed Mary's neck completely, and the axe hit the back of her head, and this caused a huge amount of pain and suffering. This could even have knocked her out, but the second blow found its target, and this almost took the Queen's head clean off, but for one piece of sinew, which held the head onto the body. Following this, the executioner sawed through the sinew, and he then picked up her head, and Mary's wig slipped off, and her head fell onto the floor. It was a shocking and botched sight, and was not the end for a queen who had a huge role in the history of the 16th century. Mary would then, following this, be embalmed, and she was left inside of the presence chamber in Fotheringhay, whilst preparations were made for her burial. But in one final act of disgrace, Mary Queen of Scots would be buried in a Protestant ceremony, against her wishes, and she would be buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral. But she would later be moved during the reign of her son. She was then buried in a huge ornate tomb in Westminster Abbey. Queen Elizabeth I would, until her dying day, regret signing off on the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Benito Mussolini had been Italy's fascist dictator since 1925, but he had been Prime Minister for years before. But his involvement in the Second World War caused a lot of controversy, and in July 1943, following the Allied invasion of Sicily, Mussolini was deposed and arrested. But then during the Gran Sasso raid he was freed, and Hitler installed him as the leader of the Italian Social Republic, a northern Italy German puppet state. But the Allies then continued to fight north, and they took Rome and Florence. But then Mussolini on the 18th of April 1945 left Garganano, a village near to Salo, where he had been living. He moved his government to Milan and based himself there. He was preparing for defeat, and he hoped that the Archbishop of Milan would help him negotiate peace with the partisans and the Allies. But after a week the army were crumbling, and Mussolini then debated making a last stand in the Italian Alps, fleeing to Switzerland, or trying to negotiate a peaceful handover with the partisans. But at this time there were orders issued against fascist politicians, and they were to be executed for their betrayal of Italy. The partisans decreed members of the fascist government of fascism, who were guilty of suppressing constitutional guarantees, destroying popular liberties, creating the fascist regime, compromising and betraying the fate of the country, and leading it to the present catastrophe, are to be punished with the penalty of death, and in less serious instances, life imprisonment. But Mussolini tried to negotiate peacefully, and this did not work, and he then fled Milan. He went towards Lake Como, and it was not known if he was trying to get to the Swiss border. He was joined by his mistress Clara Petacci, and they made a number of attempts to cross the border. But then on the 27th of April 1945, he joined a Luftwaffe convoy who were retreating to Germany. But then a group of local communist partisans attacked the convoy, which carried Mussolini and Petacci near to the village of Dongo. The convoy stopped, and there were other fascist leaders in there, but to begin with Mussolini was not recognised. They had the Germans hand over the Italians, but found slumped over was Mussolini. It was said his face was like wax in his glassy stare, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion, but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. The partisans arrested Mussolini, and he was taken to Dongo, and spent the evening in local barracks, and he was reunited with his mistress. There was fighting in the area, and there was a worry that the pair would be freed, and because of this they were taken to a safe house, a farmhouse belonging to a local peasant family. Mussolini's capture was then announced on the radio that evening, and the announcement said, "The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancour and fear, and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people, so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." There were a number of different accounts about who ordered the execution of Mussolini. The Secretary General of the Communist Party claimed he had done so, but then it was claimed that the others did this. A senior communist, Luigi Longo, said the order came from the general command of the partisan military units, and that the decision to execute him was made in the evening following his capture. Longo instructed a communist partisan of the general command, Walter Ordizio, to be the one who was sent to execute Mussolini, and he was told to go and shoot him, and Ordizio took with him another partisan, Aldo Lampredi. There were a number of accounts as to how Mussolini was executed, but the executioners left in the morning of the 28th of April 1945 to carry out the orders, and they got to Dongo, and Ordizio was driven to the farmhouse to collect Mussolini and Petacci. After they were picked up, the executioners drove 20 kilometres south, and the truck pulled up at the entrance of the Villa Belmont on a narrow road. Mussolini and Petacci were told and ordered to get out of the car and to stand by the villa's walls. Ordizio then, at 4:10 p.m, shot Mussolini and Petacci with his machine gun that he had borrowed, as his own gun had jammed. It was said Mussolini was cowardly in his final moments, and then he began to become upset, telling the executioner to aim at my heart when the execution order was given. There are differing accounts as to the events of his execution, and Ordizio said there had been a war tribunal called, which condemned the pair to death. However, following the executions, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci and other executed fascists were taken to Milan. When they got to the city, they were dumped on the ground of the Piazza Loretta, a square near to the railway station. 15 partisans had been shot there in August 1944, and the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were left, and then by 9 a.m. a huge crowd had gathered. The bodies were then beaten, spat at and were desecrated and kicked, to the point where Mussolini was so badly disfigured that he was not recognisable. Then the bodies were hanged by their feet from the metal framework of a half-built service station, and they were hanged upside down as shame. People continued to throw things, but the sight of Mussolini's remains above the crowd were haunting and shocking. But then at 2 p.m. on the 29th of April, the Americans came to the square, and they ordered the bodies to be cut down, and they were then taken to a morgue in Milan for autopsy. It was confirmed that Mussolini had been shot and killed by a number of bullets, either 7 or 9 bullets. 4 were said to have been near the heart, and were considered the cause of death. However, one of the biggest impacts of Mussolini's death was not inside of Italy, but it was inside of a bunker in Berlin. Hitler found out about Mussolini's execution, and also the subsequent display of his remains in Milan. With this, he decided that he was to end his own life, and that preparations would be made to ensure that his body did not fall into the hands of his enemies, and also this was said of Eva Braun, his wife's remains. It was said that, if Hitler did learn the full gory tale of Mussolini's death, it could have done no more than confirm his anxiety to take his own life before it was too late, and to prevent his body from being seized by his enemies. Mussolini would be later reinterred inside the Mussolini family crypt in 1957, after his remains had been dug up and were actually stolen by fascists. On the anniversary of his death, many fascists make a pilgrimage to his tomb, and thousands of people attend the graveside. Mussolini was a man who stuck with his close friend Hitler to take Italy into the Second World War, and ultimately their involvement in the war was not successful at all. He was a fascist who seized control of Italy decades before the war, and there were many people who looked at him, including Hitler, as an idol. However, he met his brutal end at the side of a road near to Lake Como, with an executioner firing at close range, killing him and his mistress, before their remains were shown in front of a huge crowd in Milan. King Louis ascended onto the throne in 1774 when he was 19 years old, and he inherited a country already in turmoil. At the time, the government was grossly in debt, and there was a growing resentment in France of the monarchy. He doubted his ability to deal with issues, and he did wish to be liked by the population, saying, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be a general wish, and I want to be loved." He was determined to do his best and to be a good king, and he wished to consult the public on a number of affairs, but his reign was plagued with poor decisions, scandal and economic suffering. Louis did accept attempts by his ministers to relieve the economic issues in France, but one of the biggest issues was that Louis was in support of the colonists in the American War of Independence, and by providing financial support to them, it plunged France to the verge of bankruptcy. He himself was seen as a big spender in the country, and at the time his population were beginning to suffer greatly. There was a crisis with people not being able to afford food and to pay for it, leading to people starving. In a last-ditch attempt to solve the financial problems, Louis assembled the Estates General, the national assembly that represented the free estates or classes of the French people, the nobility, the clergy and the commoners. This had not been gathered for over 170 years, but the commoners used it to declare itself the National Assembly, and beginning the spark of the French Revolution. To the French people, Louis and his Queen Marie Antoinette were seen as lavish spenders, and Marie also began to become a figure of hatred, as she was known for spending huge sums of the country's money on decorations, furniture, clothes, and extravagant things for herself. Whilst the people were suffering, Marie and Louis were having banquets, and this was seen as grossly inappropriate. The storming of the Bastille occurred on the 14th of July 1789, where protesters in Paris stormed the state prison, seen as a symbol of the monarchy's power, and they broke in to ransack the prison and to steal weapons and ammunition. This was seen as a huge moment in the revolution, and things continued to go downhill after this. In October 1789, an angry mob marched on Versailles and forced the royal couple to move. Louis tried to escape in June 1791, and this was seen that he was betraying the French people and consulting with foreign powers to deal with the rebels, but he was captured and was forced to accept a new constitution. In August 1792, the royal couple were arrested and were then imprisoned separately. Louis was arrested on the 13th of August and was sent to the Temple, an ancient fortress used in Paris as a prison, and within weeks the National Assembly declared France a republic and abolished the monarchy. The king was kept under arrest and was seen as a hostage, but he was also seen as dangerous, as it was predicted invading forces would try and save him. Evidence was found about his negotiations with Austria and other foreign countries, and for this the king was placed on trial. On the 11th of December 1792, he was taken from his prison to stand before the convention and to hear the charges put before him. Before the trial began, he tried to mount his defence, and he told his lawyers that he knew he would be found guilty and would be killed. He was resigned to accept his fate, and he knew what was coming, but he wanted to go down fighting. There were 3 questions that the convention were voting on. The first was, is Louis guilty? The second was, should there be an appeal to the people? And the third was, what should the punishment be for him? On the 15th of January 1793, the convention began to vote, and in total it took 36 hours to reach a decision. Louis was found overwhelmingly guilty, but there was a significant problem as to what the punishment should be. By just one vote, the sentence of death was passed for Louis, and he was condemned to death by just one single vote. A reprieve was voted down the next day, and it was voted that his execution should be conducted as swiftly as possible. His execution was scheduled for the 21st of January 1793, and his death sentence was rather controversial. To many it was seen as bringing the long-awaited end of the 1,000-year period of absolute monarchy in France, and the beginning of democracy in the nation. Others saw it as a senseless act of bloodshed, and that it showed France was heading towards a violent and immoral society. On the morning of his execution, Louis woke early. He dressed with the help of his valet, Jean-Baptiste Clary, and he then went to meet with an Irish priest, Henry Essex Edgeworth, and made his last confession. Here he heard his last mass and was given communion. The priest advised Louis to avoid saying goodbye to his family, as it would be too difficult, and at 7 o'clock he passed his final wishes on to the priest. The royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and his wedding ring to Marie, his queen. He then went to meet the commander of the guard, and in the second court a green carriage waited for him. He climbed aboard it, with the priest and 2 guards who sat opposite them. The carriage carrying the king left Temple at 9 o'clock, and for more than an hour drummers played to drown out any support that there was for the king, and they then escorted the carriage through Paris. The route was lined with 80,000 men at arms, and the cavalry who led the carriage had their sabres drawn. There was a plot to try and break the king out to save him by royalists, but this never came to anything. At 10 o'clock the carriage arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and here a scaffold had been created with a guillotine standing on it. It was surrounded by soldiers, who had guns and drums, and also a crowd who were armed with pikes and bayonets. He was approached by the executioner Sanson, who along with his assistants tied Louis's hands together. The king's hair was then cut to ensure that the execution went swiftly, and he then removed his shirt collar and was led up to the scaffold by the executioner. It was said by his priest that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone. 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Whilst on the scaffold, Louis tried to give a long speech, but a drum roll was ordered, and this led to his execution being quickened. The noise made his speech hard to understand, and with this he was then fastened quickly to the guillotine's bench. With Louis strapped to the board, he was then swiftly slid under the guillotine's yoke to hold his head in place. Once a signal was given that he was in position, the blade was released, and it quickly beheaded him. The executioner Sanson then grabbed the severed head of the king out of the basket, where it fell, and showed it to the cheering crowd. One report said that the blade did not sever his neck, and instead cut through the back of his skull and into his jaw, but as the king's head was shown, a number of the crowd rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Executioner Charles Henry Sanson told of the events that day. Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, "My people, I die innocent." Then turning towards his executioners, Louis declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson then showed the head of Louis to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la Nation! Vive la Republique!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another account recited to French author Victor Hugo stated, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution, the 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon, which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold." The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tricolor cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sanson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. Louis XVI's body was then transported to the old church of the Madeleine, and it was buried. It was said that arriving at the cemetery I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was then thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by the earth, the whole being firmly and throughoutly tampered down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. Later his remains and his queen's were reburied together inside the Basilica of Saint Denis. The execution of King Louis XVI was a pivotal moment in the history of France. It symbolised the end of the corrupt monarch that had been bleeding the country dry in the subsequent decades before, and the beginning of the revolution that led to democracy. France did suffer in the years following, with turmoil and many more executions coming, but the king's, along with his wife's, was seen as the most significant.